My name is Seth Goldwasser. I am a PhD student at the University of Pittsburgh in philosophy, and today I would love to talk to you guys about fake news and function in model pathologies. So let's get started. So for this talk, I'm going to discuss first the function of modeling in the biological and psychological sciences. Then I'm going to be talking about the function of normal proper function, according to Karen Neander and Christopher Boorse. I am then going to present a problem case for their views from psychopathology, namely the ascription of functions to psychological and social systems to explain the prevalence of dis and misinformation. Then I will recommend a shift in perspective, and then I will present my account as an alternative. All right, so let's get started. So all sciences face some generalization problem. Generalization problem is a problem concerning how we say informative things about our domain of study. We can't be too specific, nor can we be too broad. So solving a generalization problem is finding the right degree of specificity for informative explanations of the domain of science. Karen Neander and Christopher Boorse convincingly argue that the biological and psychological sciences solve their generalization problems through the construction of models by means of function ascription. Models are first and foremost representations of systems that are abstracted or idealized. Features are either excluded, abstraction, or ignored or fixed in certain ways, idealized. So according to Neander and Boorse, an effective method for abstraction and idealization in the biological and psychological sciences is the ascription of functions. We ascribe functions by decomposing systems recursively into subsystems, identifying traits among sets of target systems through, for instance, homology, holding some traits fixed and seeing what other traits do, those that are of interest, and identifying traits of interest whose activity explains why target systems are constituted the way they are, namely with those traits. This sort of process, according to Neander and Boorse, leads us to finding or identifying features of target systems that we can recognize as shared across those systems such that we can construct models of those systems. All right, so now on to normal proper function, which is the notion of function that does this. So this is a spot on which Neander and Boorse differ slightly. For Neander, a normal function is one that is ascribed on the basis of selection, natural selection or intentional selection. So those functions identify features that are informative because they perform some activity in the past which conferred an advantage to the ancestors of those systems. So we have opposable thumbs, and a function of these thumbs is for gripping. And Neander believes this is a normal function because the gripping that the opposable thumb allows for, precision gripping, was a huge advantage to early hominid species. Boorse, on the other hand, is more ahistorical. He thinks that normal functions are ascribed to model systems because they are biostatistically normal, or they fit a biostatistical within a range of a statistical norm. So features like the thumb, the opposable thumb, are identified because the gripping, the precision gripping, is one of the activities that tends to confer advantage to currently existing systems. Our ability to grip precisely helps us to survive and reproduce now. This is why it's a normal function of the thumb and why we have the thumb. Okay. So before I give the problem case, I want to discuss why it's a problem. So both Neander and Boorse would like for their accounts to be descriptive. So if they're right, then the domains of biology and psychology are restricted to the study of organisms and their environments. And the work of the biological and psychological sciences is constrained to primarily the construction of models of organisms, what they call species designs. I would amend this slightly just to say that they are committed to the claim that this is what function ascription in these sciences is constrained to. So not the entirety of the science, but of those sciences, but just simply what function ascription is constrained to. However, I'm going to be arguing that there are legitimate ascriptions of functions to traits of pathologies for the sake of model construction. Since biomedicine and psychopathology, the latter of which the example is going to be coming from, are proper subdisciplines of the relevant sciences, if Neander or Boorse's accounts fail to account for function ascriptions in those subdisciplines, then they're not descriptive. Okay, so fake news. In 2020, nearly 1/5, 17%, of engagement among the top 100 news sources on social media came from unreliable sources, compared to about 8% in 2019. So that's a doubling. This is concerning. But before we can understand what's going on here, we have to understand what fake news is. So the way I understand fake news is as content that is partially false by design and that at least partially mimics the format or practices of earnest news media. So I'm going to unpack this definition a little bit. So the things I'm taking for granted is that the content is false. And I'm going to unpack what by design and the mimicry mean. So by design, I just mean that it is false on purpose. This does not mean, though, that the content is intended to mislead. It could be that it is intended as satire or parody, but nevertheless may mislead. The by design simply just means that the content is false on purpose. The mimicry condition states that the form that the content takes is meant to be similar enough or resemble formats or practices of major news organizations, as well as smaller trustworthy organizations. So what I have in mind here, to give just an example, would be organizations that post written work on a website that looks a lot like a CNN or a Fox News or a MSNBC website. And that this mimicry of practices of major news organizations lends to the perceived facticity of the content. So now, to give an example of a function ascription to fake news, the activity of sharing fake news is identified with various psychological functions affecting social cohesion in the literature. So two of these functions, not all of the functions, but two of them are lowered vigilance against and heightened fluency for falsehoods. So we get I apologize, my dog was barking a little bit. So with lowered vigilance, we have a harder time identifying false content as false. And with heightened fluency, we have an easier time processing false content as true. In these situations, right, researchers are not tracking down lineages of organisms or histories of selection pressures applied thereon and ascribing this function. And they're also not necessarily looking for what is among the statistically normal range of action for the species either. Lowered vigilance against and higher fluency for falsehoods does not in general increase the inclusive fitness of individuals either in the past or now. Okay, so this case is troubling because, as I said, if Boorse's and Neander's accounts aim to be descriptive, then this instance of researchers ascribing functions to bits of our psychology don't seem to fit their counts. They are not selected for through evolution or natural selection or intentional selection, and they're not the statistical norm for our psychology. So I want to explain this function ascription by first proposing a shift in perspective. So the problem I take it with Neander's and Boorse's accounts is that they simply assume that the primary subject of study and the primary subject of function ascription in the relevant sciences is the organism. Function ascription to fake news, or really to our processing of fake news, suggests that this is not the case. The subject of study is often a biopsychosocial system that is partly is a part of or sometimes contains organisms, or the organism. So how does this work? Well, my thought is that researchers adopt an evolutionary dynamics perspective on things like information sharing. This does not mean that researchers are thinking of mental or social systems as organisms. They are thinking of them as pathological systems whose dynamics mirror the dynamics of organisms. Sorry, let's just say psychological or social systems. In one context, researchers understand information sharing as something to be addressed, to be treated in some cases. In another context, researchers understand information sharing as a system to be modeled. In the latter context, fictionalized uses of adaptation, fitness, selection, and the like are warranted in identifying features of causal relevance that might serve as parts of models of the spread of dis and misinformation, namely those features that are ascribed functions or parts. All right, so we have reached a shift in perspective. Well, we have finished a shift in perspective, and now I'm going to present my account, which I hope will capture both the normal functions that that Boorse and Neander take to be paradigm examples, and then also the cases that I am concerned with, the specific case being ascriptions of function to parts of our psychology in light of misinformation. Apologies again, dog is back at it. So yes, I'm now going to present my account, which I hope will capture the function ascriptions that are supposedly paradigm examples. So for example, the function of the heart to pump blood, as well as the sorts of examples that I take to be indicative of, or sorry, the example that I take to be a problem for Boorse and Neander, the sharing of fake news. All right. So more specifically, the account, which I call the system-theoretic modeling account of function, or the modeling account for short, emphasizes that researchers in biology and in psychology are at bottom interested in systems which are stable in virtue of repeated, co-adapted, mutually constraining interaction between traits at nearly every level of analysis. So the traits of the cell mutually constrain each other such that the cell, the parts of the cell are co-adapted and repeat each other through multiple iterations of cell growth, death, and reproduction. The tissues are similarly organized, the organs are similarly organized, the body is similarly organized, and so on. Organisms are just one type of stable system. I understand stability as a matter of a system's being sufficiently tolerant to displacement from equilibrium. What I mean by that is that you can push this sort of system around in various ways without it immediately collapsing. Now, you can push me on this because this is probably the most ambiguous part of the paper, how much tolerance is required before a system is stable. This is a fuzzy notion, and I don't exactly have an answer to that question, but I think that there is probably some threshold, maybe we'll never actually find it, but we can point to organisms as obvious cases of systems which have met that threshold. Okay, self-maintenance, on the other hand, is a matter of a system's having a capacity, past or present, to persist, replicate, or proliferate its traits over time. So these are just, for instance, the sorts of activities that, again, cells undergo when they recreate parts of themselves to maintain their internal integrity, or to copy DNA, or to process ATP, and so on. Some philosophers have called this organizational closure. Others have called it autopoiesis. Stability through self-maintenance. So the kind of stability attained through a system by itself, maintaining itself, as I understand it, has been called autopoiesis or organizational closure. And my account puts that center stage. So the specific account is as follows. An activity of a trait is a function, and so that trait forms part of a model, just in case the presence of the trait in a type of target system, where I'm understanding types to be composed of tokens, is due to the contribution that that part makes through its activity that we're interested in. And specifically the contribution it makes to the self-maintenance and through the self-maintenance stability of tokens which make up the type. So you have individual persons in the case of fake news. They consume fake news. Their consumption of fake news lowers their vigilance and heightens their fluency, and they continue to consume fake news as a result, and this creates a certain sort of cycle in the individual. The type in question that I'm concerned with would be mid and forebrains with specific components, or the component being the person with that specific mid or forebrain structure. So I'm thinking specifically of striatum or basal ganglia. The consumption of fake news and lowered vigilance and higher fluency that result leads to the persistence of a certain sort of modified striatum and aids the maintenance of striatums so modified. And through this, we can construct, so through seeing this modified striatum in a number of individuals, we may be able to construct a model of the system, which would be the person or the brain or the part of the brain, depending. So this, if this works, and it, to be completely clear, does not have to be a specific part of the brain. It could be a purely psychological sort of trait, or a social trait. It does not have to be a biological trait, but I think it's easiest to use biological traits as an example. It may turn out that the lowered vigilance and heightened fluency are not always manifest in the same place in the brain. So we may have to look elsewhere to find the consistent trait, and that may be in the psychological realm or the social realm. So I just want to kind of flag that as a disclaimer. So that concludes my talk. Thank you so much. And here are a bunch of references. All right. Thank you so much.